Rich boy forces black maid to crawl like a dog. Next day, she destroys their 330 meters empire. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Langston estate, spilling golden light onto polished marble floors. The mansion stood like a fortress of wealth, with chandeliers that glittered as if they alone could blind anyone who dared question the power of the family that lived within. For most people in the small town, stepping inside this mansion was an unimaginable dream. For Amara, it was simply where she worked. Dressed in her crisp black and white uniform, Amara adjusted the lace cap that sat neatly on her head and carried a silver tray of teacups into the grand sitting room. She was young, only in her late 20s, but her quiet confidence and graceful movements often made her appear older. Every step she took carried the discipline of someone who respected herself, even when others did not. Seated in the room were the Langstons, a family that had long been the definition of arrogance. Mr. Richard Langston, the patriarch, was a man with a commanding presence. Though age had softened his posture, his wife Eleanor carried herself with a kind of cold perfection, dressed always in designer gowns and pearls. On the sofa sat Gregory Langston, their only son, the heir to their billion-dollar empire. Gregory was handsome in a way that made people notice him, but his charm was often drowned out by his cruelty. Amara entered quietly, setting the tray down on the polished mahogany table. She had done this task 100 times, and she carried herself with the same professionalism she always did. But Gregory's eyes followed her every movement, and a mischievous smirk spread across his face. He was bored, and boredom often led him to cruelty. "Fetch me the paper, will you?" he said in a commanding tone. Amara gave a polite nod, retrieved the folded newspaper from the stand, and handed it to him. She thought that would be the end of it, but Gregory had other ideas. "You know, Amara," he said, leaning back with mock thoughtfulness, "sometimes I wonder if you're really cut out to be a maid. You're too serious, too proud. It makes me think you need to be reminded of your place." Amara paused. She had heard comments like this before, but something in Gregory's voice made her uneasy. She stood still, clutching the tray against her stomach. "What do you mean, sir?" she asked quietly. Gregory's smirk deepened. He stood, walked toward her, and held out his hand. In it was a rope he must have kept hidden just for this moment. "Down on your hands and knees," he ordered. The room fell silent. Mr. Langston looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Eleanor's lips tightened, yet she did not intervene. It was as if cruelty had become so normal in this household that they no longer recognized it as cruelty. Amara's breath caught in her chest. She had spent her life working with dignity. She had scrubbed floors, polished silver, and carried trays without complaint. But never had she been asked to surrender her humanity like this. "Sir, please," she whispered, her voice trembling but still controlled. "This is not appropriate." Gregory's eyes hardened. He grabbed her wrist firmly and shoved the rope toward her. "I said down. Crawl like a good little dog for your master. Show us all how well you can serve." Her heart pounded. For a moment she wanted to resist, to shout, to walk out of the mansion forever. But she also knew the weight of her circumstances. She needed this job. Her rent, her younger brother's tuition, her mother's medical bills, all of it depended on the income she earned here. Losing it would mean disaster for her family. With a burning shame she could hardly contain, Amara lowered herself onto her knees. The polished floor was cold beneath her palms. Gregory looped the rope loosely around her neck like a leash. Behind him, his parents watched in silence, their faces unreadable. "Now bark," Gregory demanded, his voice echoing against the high ceilings. "Bark like a dog, Amara." Her eyes filled with tears, but she bit them back. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She kept her head high even from the floor. She did not bark. Gregory sneered. "You think you're above me, don't you? Above all of us? You're nothing but the help. And don't forget it." He pulled the rope slightly, just enough to make the humiliation complete. For what felt like an eternity, Amara stayed there, frozen in place, her body kneeling, her spirit burning. Inside, her mind screamed. Each second carved the memory deeper, not as a moment of defeat, but as the seed of something greater. Finally, Eleanor cleared her throat. "That's enough, Gregory. You've had your fun." Gregory rolled his eyes, but he released the rope and tossed it onto the floor. "Fine. Let her go back to being invisible." Amara rose slowly, her face calm, her movements precise. She picked up the tray, bowed her head slightly, and walked out of the room. No one in the family looked at her as she left. To them, she was already forgotten. But in her heart, Amara knew this moment would never be forgotten. She walked down the long hallway of the mansion, each step heavier than the last. The humiliation clung to her skin like a stain she could not wash off, and yet beneath the weight of her shame, something else began to take root: resolve. When she reached the small staff quarters at the back of the estate, she sat on her narrow bed and buried her face in her hands. Silent tears slipped through her fingers, not only for herself but for every insult. Every injustice she had endured while serving those who thought wealth gave them the right to degrade others. But after the tears came silence. And after the silence came a thought that grew louder with each passing second. They thought they had broken her. They thought she would crawl forever. But Amara knew something they did not. She was not just a maid. She was a woman of education, intelligence, and unshakable will. They could humiliate her body, but they could never chain her spirit. In that moment, she made a promise to herself. She would not just leave this job. She would not just walk away. She would rise so high that the very people who had tried to strip her dignity would be forced to look up at her. That night, as the mansion quieted and the Langstons fell asleep in their silk sheets, Amara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her heart still hurt, her pride still burned, but her mind was already moving. She thought about her past, her education, the dreams she had buried when life forced her into service. And then she thought about the Langstons' empire, their businesses, their power, their arrogance. She had seen enough while working in their home to know that behind the polished image was something rotten. As dawn approached, Amara whispered into the silence of her room, "They think I am nothing. But tomorrow they will know who I am." Her words carried no bitterness, only certainty. And so began a journey that would transform humiliation into triumph, and a maid into the architect of justice. The morning after the humiliation, Amara woke up before the alarm clock on her bedside table could ring. Her eyes had barely closed through the night. Every time she drifted off, she was pulled back by the memory of Gregory's voice, sharp and cruel, ordering her onto her knees like she was less than human. She could still feel the cold floor pressing against her palms, the rope brushing her neck, and the weight of eyes that had judged her without compassion. Yet, as she sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the staff quarters, she did not allow despair to take over. Instead, she let the sting of the memory harden into resolve. She dressed carefully, smoothing the wrinkles from her uniform with deliberate movements. To anyone else, she looked like the same maid she had always been, neat, quiet, invisible. But behind her steady gaze was a storm. As she tied her apron strings, she thought of her mother, who had raised her with dignity even when they had nothing. She thought of her younger brother, who looked up to her as a symbol of courage and guidance. She thought of herself, not as a servant, but as a woman who had once stood at the top of her class at university, with professors who had called her brilliant and classmates who had admired her potential. That part of her life had been forced into silence by hardship, but it had not disappeared. It had only been waiting for a reason to return. When she stepped into the hallways of the mansion, the grandeur that once intimidated her now seemed shallow. Every chandelier, every polished surface, every velvet curtain felt like a mask covering the truth of the Langstons. Their empire, worth hundreds of millions, looked powerful on the outside, but Amara had seen enough to know it was not built on honesty. She had overheard Richard Langston's late-night phone calls filled with sharp whispers about loopholes and hidden accounts. She had carried letters sealed with urgency and greed. She had noticed the way Eleanor entertained guests who were more than friends of the family, men whose business dealings left trails of damage behind them. And she had watched Gregory, reckless and arrogant, flaunt money he had not earned, humiliating people just because he could. Each observation had seemed insignificant before, just fragments of a world she had no place in. But now those fragments began to form a picture in her mind. The humiliation she had endured gave her clarity. She realized that she had not been powerless all along. She had knowledge. She had intelligence. And she had access to the cracks in the Langstons' empire, cracks they were too arrogant to see. That day she performed her duties as usual, her face calm, her voice steady. She poured tea, polished silver, and carried trays with grace. But in her mind she was building a plan. Each task became an opportunity to listen, to watch, to remember. She paid attention to where documents were left, to which guests visited, to the conversations that drifted from one room to another. She memorized names, dates, and numbers with the sharpness of someone who knew how to connect them later. At lunch, Gregory passed her in the hallway. He gave her a smirk, the same kind he had worn the night before, but she did not flinch. She met his eyes just long enough to let him know that she remembered, then lowered her gaze politely, continuing her walk. Inside, she thought, "You believe you have won, but you have no idea who I am." By evening, Amara returned to her small room at the back of the house. She opened a notebook she had kept hidden, its pages filled with thoughts, numbers, and reminders from her past. It was not just a notebook. It was a record of the person she used to be, a woman who had studied finance and law, who had written essays praised for their insight, who had dreamed of creating a business to help communities like hers rise out of poverty. That notebook had stayed closed for too long, but tonight, it opened like a door she was walking through again. She began to write down everything she remembered about the Langstons, names of companies they owned, investments they bragged about at the dinner table, whispers of lawsuits they claimed to have settled quietly. She wrote with precision, her mind sharpening with every line. What began as fragments slowly grew into a map of greed, corruption, and arrogance that stretched across every part of their empire. As she wrote, she felt something shifting inside her. The shame of crawling on the floor began to fade, replaced by a quiet strength. She realized that humiliation was only powerful if it was allowed to break her spirit. Instead, she was using it as fuel. For the first time in a long while, she felt her heart beat with purpose. She closed the notebook and looked at the ceiling, whispering to herself, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." The following morning, Amara moved through the mansion with the same quiet grace as always. But something about her felt different. She was no longer a maid surviving from one day to the next. She was a woman on a mission. Every word she spoke, every glance she gave, every detail she observed was part of a greater purpose. She was no longer just serving the Langstons. She was studying them, preparing for the day she would no longer walk behind them but stand above them. And though no one could see it yet, the silent strength inside her was growing into something unstoppable. Amara walked through the halls of the Langston mansion with quiet steps, her face calm, her hands steady, but her heart carried 1,000 unspoken stories. To those around her, she was invisible. To the Langstons, she was only the maid who blended into the wallpaper, serving food and cleaning messes without a voice. Yet behind her composed expression lived a woman who had lived another life, a life the Langstons could not even imagine. Long before she had ever put on a maid's uniform, Amara had been a student whose future was as bright as the morning sun. Her teachers had called her brilliant, a mind rare enough to change the world. She had studied with intensity, devouring books on law, economics, and finance, her notebooks filled with ideas about building fairness in systems that were designed to favor only the wealthy. At university, professors had praised her essays and classmates had come to her for guidance. She had dreamed of becoming someone who would use knowledge not to exploit, but to uplift. But life had not been kind. Her father's sudden death had left the family without support. Her mother had fallen ill and her younger brother had been too young to help. Amara had been forced to abandon her final years of study to work, taking whatever job she could find to keep food on the table and medicine in her mother's hands. She had taken the uniform of a maid not because it was what she was meant for, but because it was what survival demanded. Each day she had told herself it was temporary, just until the storm passed. Yet years later she was still here, trapped in the service of people who mistook her necessity for weakness. As she polished the silver trays in the grand dining room, her mind wandered back to lectures she once attended, where debates about ethics in business had filled the air with passion. She remembered the way her professors had spoken about the danger of unchecked greed, about how empires built on deception would one day fall. She remembered how she had written a paper arguing that the fall always came not from outside threats, but from the arrogance within. Now, standing in the Langstons' mansion, those words came back to her like a prophecy she was beginning to see unfold. That night, after the day's work was done, she returned to her small room and opened her hidden notebook again. This time, she did not just record details about the Langstons. She wrote about herself. She wrote about who she had been, reminding herself that she was more than the uniform on her back. She was the girl who had once won scholarships, the girl who had stayed up late in libraries studying by the dim light of lamps, the girl who had dreamed of changing the world with ideas that mattered. She wrote until her hand cramped, filling page after page with memories, with fragments of knowledge that had been buried but not lost. As she wrote, she realized something profound. Her past was not gone, it was waiting. Every class she had taken, every book she had read, every idea she had once believed in was still inside her, like a flame hidden under ashes. All it needed was air to burn again, and the humiliation she had endured had given her that air. What Gregory thought was his victory had, in truth, lit a fire she had almost forgotten. The next morning, when she carried tea into the library, Gregory was there, lounging in a chair with his feet propped on a table, scrolling through his phone with the arrogance of someone who believed the world belonged to him. He glanced at her with the same dismissive smirk, expecting to see shame lingering in her eyes. But Amara gave him nothing. Her gaze was steady, her movements graceful, her silence unbreakable. Inside, though, she was already pulling threads, connecting dots, remembering names and figures she had overheard from his careless conversations. Later that day, she passed by Mr. Langston's study while he was on the phone. His voice was sharp, hurried, carrying the tone of a man juggling too many secrets. Amara paused just outside, dusting the shelves with a feather duster, her ears catching every word. Offshore accounts, transfers, silence payments, pieces of a puzzle that most people would miss, but to Amara they were bright signals. She did not need to write them down. Her memory, sharpened by years of discipline, held onto them tightly. She moved through the mansion like a shadow, performing her duties flawlessly while gathering every detail she could. The Langstons thought she was invisible, and that was their mistake. They did not know that invisibility gave her access. They did not know that every careless word, every tossed-aside paper, every arrogant display of wealth was a thread she was weaving into a net. At night, she poured everything into her notebook, sketching out connections between companies, investments, and questionable dealings. Slowly, the picture became clearer. The Langstons' empire was not as strong as it appeared. It was built on sand, on lies, on fragile foundations that could collapse with the right push. For the first time in years, Amara felt alive with purpose. The humiliation she had suffered had not crushed her. It had awakened her. She was no longer simply enduring her life. She was reclaiming it. The woman she had been, the scholar, the dreamer, the fighter, was returning. And this time she had more than ambition. She had a reason. As she closed her notebook and lay down that night, she whispered to herself words she had once written at the end of an essay in university. The powerful fall when the powerless refused to stay silent. Her eyes closed, and sleep came at last. Not with nightmares of crawling on the floor, but with visions of rising higher than she had ever imagined. The days in the Langston mansion blended together in a pattern of routines that, to most people, would have seemed dull. Breakfast laid out at precisely 9 in the morning, luncheons that stretched into the afternoon, dinners filled with shallow laughter that echoed through the grand dining room. To Amara, however, every day was alive with detail. Every cup she placed on the table, every tray she carried into her room, every hallway she walked down offered her a new glimpse into the cracks within the family's empire. And now she had stopped simply noticing. She had begun to collect. It started with something small. One afternoon, while tidying the study, she noticed a document carelessly left on the desk. It was a set of financial reports, the kind that most would find meaningless numbers on a page. But to Amara, with her sharp memory and her background in finance, those numbers told a story. The family's flagship company had been inflating its profits for years, hiding losses through shell corporations that only someone trained to recognize patterns would catch. She stood over the desk, eyes scanning every line, committing it to memory with the precision of someone who knew she might never see the papers again. She did not dare steal them, but she did not need to. Her mind, disciplined and sharp, was enough. That evening, in the quiet of her small room, she sketched the numbers into her notebook from memory, each line connected to another, forming a trail of deceit. And as she worked, her hands steady and her eyes burning with focus, she realized she had stumbled upon something greater than her own revenge. She had discovered the truth about the Langstons' empire. It was not untouchable. From that moment, everything changed. She no longer felt like a maid trapped in a cycle of humiliation and silence. She felt like an investigator, someone with the power to uncover what others had ignored. Every word she overheard became evidence, every name she remembered became a lead, every careless slip of paper became a clue. The mansion, which had once been a prison, had become a library of secrets waiting for her to read. But gathering information was not enough. Amara knew that. Knowledge only mattered if it could be used. And for that, she needed allies. It was on a Sunday morning while she was at the local market buying vegetables for the kitchen that the first opportunity came. At a nearby stall, she overheard a conversation between two men about an investigative journalist named Daniel Hayes. His articles had exposed corrupt business owners before, and his name was spoken with both admiration and fear in the town. Amara tucked the name away in her mind, the way she did with everything else. Later that night, she searched for him quietly on a public computer at the library. His articles were fierce, sharp, and unafraid of the powerful. She knew instantly that he was the kind of person she needed to connect with. The thought of reaching out terrified her. What if he did not believe her? What if she put her family at risk? The Langstons had power, influence, and money that could silence people who stood in their way. But then she remembered that night on the floor. The rope around her neck, the sneer on Gregory's face. She remembered how small they had tried to make her feel. And she decided fear would no longer control her. The first letter she wrote to Daniel Hayes was simple, unsigned, and careful. She did not reveal her identity but hinted that someone inside the Langston household knew of fraud that reached into the millions. She included small details, just enough to prove her knowledge was real but not enough to expose herself. She mailed it and waited. 2 weeks later, she received a reply in the same post office box she had carefully arranged under a false name. The letter was short, but it carried weight. If what you say is true, we need to meet. There are people who must hear this story. Her heart raced as she read the words. For the first time, she felt the distance between herself and the Langstons narrowing. The empire that had seemed so untouchable was no longer a towering fortress. It was a structure with cracks, and she had just found someone willing to help widen them. Back in the mansion, the Langstons remained oblivious. Gregory continued his reckless games, sneering at servants and flaunting his wealth in front of friends. Eleanor kept entertaining guests with her cold smile and sharper tongue. Richard carried on with his secretive phone calls, thinking his wealth shielded him from consequence. None of them noticed the maid who moved silently through their halls, gathering the very weapons that would destroy them. One evening, as Amara cleared away dishes from the dining table, Gregory leaned back in his chair, sipping wine. He looked at her with that same arrogant smirk. "You look too proud for a maid, Amara," he said, his tone mocking. "Do not forget, you're only here because we allow it." Amara lowered her eyes respectfully, but inside she smiled. If Gregory had known how close she was to pulling the ground out from under him, he would not have spoken so boldly. She realized then that silence was not weakness, it was strategy. She did not need to fight him in the open. She would let him underestimate her until it was too late. That night she met Daniel Hayes for the first time in a quiet cafe far from the mansion. She wore plain clothes and a simple headscarf to avoid recognition. When she walked in, he was already seated in a corner, his eyes scanning the room with the caution of someone used to watching his back. "You're the one who sent the letter?" he asked when she sat across from him. "Yes," she said softly. "And you work for the Langstons?" "I do," she admitted. "And I know things. Enough to bring them down if you are willing to listen." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Then you need to tell me everything. But you must also be ready because once this begins, there will be no turning back." Amara nodded, her hand steady on the table. "I have already decided. They took my dignity, but they will not take my silence. If I must risk myself to expose them, I will." In that moment, the turning point became real. She was no longer the maid who endured humiliation quietly. She was the woman who would pull back the curtain on a billion-dollar empire, brick by brick, truth by truth. When she left the cafe that night, the streets felt different beneath her feet. The air seemed clearer, the world brighter. She was not powerless. She was not invisible. She was the one who held the first thread that, once pulled, would unravel everything the Langstons thought would last forever. And as she walked back toward the mansion, her head held high, she whispered to herself, "The day is coming." The days in the Langston household carried on as if nothing had changed. Gregory still strutted through the mansion with his smug arrogance. Eleanor still hosted her luncheons in dresses worth more than a worker's yearly wages. And Richard still held his phone calls late into the night, whispering about numbers and deals in corners he believed were safe. To them, life was as steady as the marble pillars that held up their home. But beneath that polished surface, the ground had already begun to shift, and they had no idea who was pulling at the fault lines. Amara moved through her duties with the same grace and composure as always, but now her silence was filled with purpose. She no longer carried trays just to serve food. She carried information. She no longer polished silver simply to see her reflection in it. She polished while listening to the conversations that bounced carelessly off the walls. And when she retired to her small room at night, she no longer collapsed from exhaustion. She sat at her little desk, her notebook open, her pen flying across the pages as she pieced together a story no one in the mansion knew was being written. Her meetings with Daniel Hayes became more frequent, though always in secret. Sometimes in quiet cafes, sometimes in the library where whispers disappeared between the stacks of books, sometimes in the park where the sound of children playing hid the gravity of their conversations. With every meeting, Amara gave him more. Names of companies the Langstons used to hide money, accounts that existed only on paper, details of conversations that exposed corruption woven into their empire. Daniel listened carefully, recording every word, his eyes sharpening as the story grew larger. "You understand," he told her one evening. "Once this goes public, it will shake everything. This is not just about a few lies on a financial statement. This is fraud, bribery, exploitation. If this is proven, it could destroy them completely." "That is the point," Amara replied quietly. "They think they are untouchable. They think they can humiliate and exploit without consequence. But they are wrong." Each revelation she handed to Daniel felt like a piece of her dignity being restored. With every detail, she was rewriting her place in the story. No longer the silent maid, no longer the humiliated servant, but the voice that would echo through headlines and boardrooms. Still, it was not without fear. Every time she walked through the mansion after a secret meeting, she felt the weight of danger pressing in on her. If the Langstons suspected her, she knew what they were capable of. Their money bought silence. Their power crushed opposition. But Amara reminded herself that she had already faced the worst humiliation they could offer, and she had survived it. Fear, once it has broken you, cannot break you the same way again. One night, as she returned to her room after clearing the dining table, she overheard Gregory laughing with a group of friends. His voice, loud and mocking, carried down the hall. "You should have seen her," he bragged. "On her knees like some mutt. That maid will never forget who owns her. People like her exist to remind us how much better we are." His friends laughed, clinking glasses. Amara stopped in the shadows, her hands clenched around the tray she carried. For a brief moment, anger threatened to overwhelm her, but then it passed, replaced by something stronger. Pity. Gregory, for all his arrogance, was blind. He was laughing at a memory that made him feel powerful. Not realizing it had already planted the seeds of his downfall, she smiled faintly to herself as she walked away. Let him laugh. Soon, the world would be laughing at him. Weeks later, the first article appeared. Daniel had moved carefully, double-checking every fact Amara provided, corroborating details with other sources. When the story broke, it was not just a whisper, it was a storm. Headlines in bold letters spread across newspapers and online platforms. Langston Empire under investigation for fraud and corruption. The mansion buzzed with tension the next morning. Richard slammed the newspaper down at the breakfast table, his face red with fury. "Lies," he shouted. "Complete lies. Who dares publish such filth?" Eleanor's hands trembled as she sipped her coffee, her calm exterior cracking just slightly. Gregory, pale and wide-eyed, tried to laugh it off, but his voice wavered. "It will blow over," he said. "We are the Langstons. No one can touch us." But Amara, standing quietly at the side of the room with the coffee pot in her hand, knew otherwise. She watched their panic with the same calm composure she had worn every day, hiding the satisfaction that burned inside her. The cracks had begun to show, and there was no repairing them. The following days brought more articles, more revelations. Reporters camped outside the estate, cameras flashing as cars pulled in and out. Business partners began to distance themselves, their calls growing colder and shorter. Investors whispered of pulling out, stocks dipped, and the empire that once seemed invincible began to tremble. Inside the mansion, tension thickened like smoke. Richard grew restless, barking orders into his phone late into the night. Eleanor stopped hosting luncheons, retreating into silence. Gregory lashed out at servants, snapping at anyone who crossed his path, his arrogance now a shield for his fear. Through it all, Amara remained steady. She poured coffee, carried trays, cleaned rooms. But in her silence, she watched them unravel. Every shout, every slammed door, every restless night was proof that her plan was working. At her next meeting with Daniel, she brought even more evidence, copies of documents she had carefully obtained, overheard conversations about offshore accounts, details of bribes disguised as consulting fees. Daniel's eyes lit with fire as he read. "This will not just shake them," he said. "This will end them." Amara nodded. "That is what justice looks like." The more the story grew, the more powerful it became. Other victims began to come forward. Workers who had been underpaid, partners who had been cheated, employees who had been silenced. What began as Amara's secret war turned into a movement. Voices joining together to expose the corruption of the empire. Back at the mansion, Amara moved silently through the halls, her head bowed, her expression calm. To the Langstons, she was still invisible, but in truth she was everywhere. In every headline, in every article, in every whisper of scandal, her presence lingered. They had tried to reduce her to nothing, but she had become the force they could not escape. And as she lay in bed one night, the sounds of shouting echoing faintly from the grand halls, she whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning." The Langston mansion, once a symbol of power and wealth, had become a fortress under siege. Reporters stood at the gates day and night, cameras flashing, microphones raised, eager to capture any glimpse of the family that had once moved through society untouchable. Neighbors whispered, business partners distanced themselves, and former allies found excuses not to return calls. Inside the mansion, the silence that once felt regal now pressed down like a weight too heavy to bear. Richard Langston sat in his study surrounded by stacks of papers. His once confident posture slumped as he shouted into the phone. His words, once sharp and commanding, now stumbled in desperation. "You cannot pull out now. Do you know what this will do to us? We made you rich and now you abandon us." He slammed the receiver down, his face flushed with anger and fear. The man who once believed his money made him invincible now looked like a king watching his kingdom burn. Eleanor paced the halls, her pearls still hanging around her neck but no longer shining as before. She muttered to herself, wringing her hands, her carefully perfected smile gone. Friends who had once dined at her table no longer answered invitations, and the women she had laughed with at charity events turned their backs when her name was mentioned. The isolation cut her deeper than the scandals themselves. For a woman who thrived on appearances, being ignored was a slow death. Gregory, however, reacted differently. He grew more reckless, more explosive. He shouted at staff, broke glasses in fits of rage, and stormed through the mansion as if noise could drown out his fear. One evening, drunk and furious, he confronted Amara in the kitchen. "This is all lies," he yelled, his words slurring. "They are jealous. They want to see us fall because we are better than them." He staggered closer, pointing a finger in her face. "And you walk around here like you know something." "Do not think I have not noticed that look in your eyes." Amara met his gaze calmly, her voice steady. "I am only doing my work, sir." Her composure unsettled him. He stared at her for a moment, confused by the absence of fear he expected, then cursed under his breath and stormed out. Amara stood still, her heart steady. She knew Gregory's fury was nothing compared to the storm already breaking outside. Each day brought new headlines. More evidence surfaced, more witnesses came forward, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. What began as whispers of fraud had grown into full-blown investigations. Government agencies opened cases, investors fled, and the Langstons' empire, valued at hundreds of millions, began to crumble. Their once booming companies now faced lawsuits, fines, and public outrage. The collapse was no longer just financial. It was social, reputational, complete. Inside her room, Amara listened to the distant shouts echoing through the mansion walls. She opened her notebook, flipping through the pages filled with her handwriting, pages that had once seemed like fragments of a dream. Now they were the blueprint of reality. She thought back to the moment she had been forced onto her knees, to Gregory's mocking laughter, to the silence of his parents who had allowed it. That memory no longer brought pain, it brought strength. It was proof of how far she had come. One evening, She walked through the library carrying a tray when she overheard Richard speaking to Eleanor in hushed, frantic tones. "It is over, Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking. "The accounts are frozen. The partners have left us, and the investigators will not stop. We are finished." Eleanor's reply was a whisper, heavy with disbelief. "After everything we built, after everything we sacrificed, it ends like this?" Amara paused at the doorway, her back to them, her face expressionless. She did not speak, but inside she felt the truth settle like a stone. The mighty had fallen, not with a single blow, but with the weight of their own corruption finally revealed. The final blow came when federal agents arrived at the estate. Cars lined the driveway, men and women in dark suits stepping out with files and warrants. Cameras flashed as the gates opened, and the family that once lived above the law now found themselves surrounded by it. Reporters shouted questions, their voices rising over each other, while the agents moved with quiet efficiency. Amara watched from the shadows of the hallway as the Langstons were questioned, their voices trembling, their faces pale. Gregory tried to protest, shouting about lies and jealousy, but his words carried no weight anymore. Richard sat in silence, his hands trembling, while Eleanor wept quietly, her composure gone. The agents carried boxes of documents out of the study, files that Amara had once seen lying carelessly on desks, numbers she had memorized, conversations she had overheard. Now those same details stood as evidence against the family. What had once been their power had become their undoing. As the agents left, the mansion felt hollow. The chandeliers still glittered, the marble still shone, but the aura of power had disappeared. What remained was only a house filled with echoes of arrogance and the dust of collapse. Amara returned to her room, sitting at her desk with her notebook open before her. She traced her fingers over the pages, over the words and numbers that had guided her here. She thought of her mother, who had taught her that dignity was more valuable than gold. She thought of her brother, whose future she had fought to protect. And she thought of herself, the woman who had once been humiliated, who had once been told she was nothing, who now held the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had destroyed an empire, not with violence, but with truth. The collapse was complete. The Langstons were no longer untouchable. They were exposed, broken, and powerless. And though they would never admit it, the servant they had tried to silence had become the voice that ended them. Amara closed her notebook, her lips curving into the faintest smile. She had not only taken back her dignity, she had proven to the world that strength does not come from wealth or arrogance. It comes from resilience, from intelligence, from the refusal to remain silent. And as the night settled over the crumbling empire, Amara whispered to herself, "This is justice." When the storm had passed, when the cameras had stopped flashing outside the mansion and the reporters had moved on to other scandals, the Langstons were no longer names that carried power. They had become examples, stories whispered with scorn, faces plastered across newspapers under headlines about fraud, arrogance, and downfall. Their empire, once worth more than $300 million, had crumbled into lawsuits, frozen accounts, and auctioned assets. The family that once looked down on everyone now lived under the gaze of a world that had finally seen their corruption exposed. For Amara, life began to change in quiet but powerful ways. She left the mansion without fanfare, carrying only her notebook and a small suitcase. No one stopped her, no one noticed. She walked out of the grand estate the same way she had walked in every day for years. But this time she was not the maid. She was the woman who had turned silence into strength and humiliation into power. She did not need to announce her victory. The collapse of the Langstons spoke for her. In the weeks that followed, she stayed with her mother and younger brother in their modest home. Her mother's health had stabilized, thanks to the medical treatments Amara's earnings had paid for, and her brother was still in school, his dreams of finishing his education burning bright. For the first time in years, Amara felt the weight of survival lifting. She no longer had to wake before dawn to scrub floors for a family that mocked her existence. She no longer had to bow her head to arrogance disguised as wealth. She was free. But freedom, Amara realized, was not enough. She had been given more than just escape. She had been given an opportunity, and she refused to waste it. The evidence she had provided, the testimony she had given, had not only destroyed the Langstons but had also led to restitution funds being set aside for the people they had exploited. Workers who had been underpaid, partners who had been cheated, and communities harmed by their greed were to receive compensation. It was not enough to erase the pain, but it was a beginning. Amara used her share of the settlement to start something she had once only dreamed of, a business of her own. It was not a grand corporation or a glittering empire. It was a community initiative, a foundation that provided education, training, and opportunities for people who had been overlooked and underestimated just as she had been. She hired women who had been dismissed as unskilled, men who had been told they were replaceable, and young people who had been denied chances because of their background. She saw in them the same resilience she had carried, and she gave them not just jobs but dignity. At the opening of her first small office, she stood before a group of people who had gathered to support her. Her voice was calm, steady, and filled with quiet conviction. We are told too often that our worth is measured by wealth, by status, by the approval of those who sit above us. But I stand here today to tell you that our worth has nothing to do with the arrogance of others. Our worth is in our resilience, in our intelligence, in our refusal to bow down to humiliation. I know this because I was once told I was nothing, and today I stand here free. The applause that followed was not loud or thunderous, but it was sincere. It was the sound of people who understood, who saw themselves in her, who felt her words not as a speech but as truth. Amara's story began to spread quietly. Journalists who had once reported on the Langstons' downfall now turned their attention to her rise. Articles were written not about scandal but about resilience, about the maid who had brought down an empire and built something better in its place. She became a symbol, not of revenge but of justice. Gregory, meanwhile, disappeared from headlines, his arrogance swallowed by the silence of disgrace. Eleanor retreated into obscurity, and Richard spent his remaining years fighting battles in courtrooms he could not win. The mansion that had once stood as their monument was sold, its chandeliers and marble floors stripped away, leaving only empty walls. To the world, the Langstons were finished. To Amara, they were simply the past. One evening, as she sat by the window of her modest new office looking out at the city lights, she opened her old notebook. The pages were filled with the numbers and notes that had once been her weapon. She turned to the last page and wrote in steady handwriting, "It began with humiliation. It ended with triumph. And in between, it was built on silence, strength, and truth." She closed the notebook and set it aside, knowing she no longer needed it. The fire that had once fueled her to bring down the Langstons had given birth to something greater. She was no longer fighting against them. She was building for others. Her mother, watching her from the doorway, smiled faintly. "You always had this in you, Amara. Even when life tried to bury it, I knew you would rise." Amara turned and smiled back, her eyes soft but steady. "I did not rise alone. I carried all of us with me, and it was true." Her triumph was not just hers. It belonged to her family, to the workers who had been silenced, to the people who had been exploited by the empire of greed. It belonged to anyone who had ever been told they were less, anyone who had ever been humiliated and forced to crawl, anyone who had ever been underestimated. The Langstons had once forced her onto her knees. They had laughed, believing they had stripped her of dignity, but in truth they had only given her the reason to rise higher than they could ever reach. As the night deepened and the city lights glittered like stars, Amara felt peace settle over her. She was no longer defined by what had been done to her. She was defined by what she had built, by the strength she had discovered, by the lives she was now changing. Her story was not one of wealth or power, it was one of resilience. And though the empire of the Langstons had crumbled into dust, the legacy of Amara Caldwell was just beginning.